Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Adam Smith's Panmure House on this beautiful and sunny Edinburgh evening. You've chosen to be here during one of the world's greatest arts festival. And instead of going to some odd dance performance or theater production, you've come to the home of world-renowned son of Kirkcaldy, I would say son of Edinburgh as well, but that's not true. Adam Smith's home, where he lived between 1778 and 1790. Panmure House is not a museum, though it may look like a museum in some respects, as it's been renovated to its old glory. Rather, for us, Panmure House and the legacy of Adam Smith, and by extension, the Scottish Enlightenment, is an invitation. It's an invitation to forge new thinking and innovative ideas on the pressing issues of today. Indeed, many of the kinds of questions that Smith and his colleagues of the Scottish Enlightenment were asking and reflecting on are in many ways no different than the kinds of questions that would drive many contemporary debates, from the origins of morality to what makes a good political economy, what makes countries wealthy, prosperous, and just. How can we address poverty as an issue of material well-being, but also as an issue of happiness and aesthetic enrichment? What is the role of the state in the economy, in education, in the provision of public goods? In short, what kind of society do we want to live in, and what do we owe each other? As such, many of our programs here at Panmure House, including the one this evening, are designed to engage us with the big issues that face us today and to promote nuanced, respectful debate at a time when it is much needed. And tonight we welcome the world community to Panmure House. This lecture is one of a series of 8 lectures by the University of Glasgow's Templeton Adam Smith Tercentenary Fellows that will take place around the world in 2023. Indeed, this year, 2023, is the 300th anniversary of Adam Smith. And it's a significant year, not simply for the University of Glasgow, but for Panmure House, for Kirkcaldy. And last year, there was much organization to come together to make sure that the events across Scotland, in Glasgow, here in Edinburgh, and in Kirkcaldy, do justice to the legacy of Adam Smith and bring those that haven't or have never read Smith into a world that is actually still relevant to this day. The project, as I mentioned, is generously supported by the Templeton Foundation, and its aim is to provide the opportunity for scholars, intellectuals, and the global public to connect with Smith's thinking and work with 21st century challenges in an engaging and accessible way. And it's led by Professor Craig Smith of the University of Glasgow. Tonight, we are privileged to have Professor Chandran Kukathas give a lecture. He is a professor of political science and dean and Lee Kong Chian professor of political science at the School of Social Sciences at Singapore Management University. He was the head of the Department of Government at the London School of Economics and Political Science from 2015 to 2019. Prior to that, he was the chair of political theory in the Department of Government, also at the LSE. And he held positions at many places across the world, from the Australian Defence Force Academy to the University of Utah in the middle of the United States, to George Mason University, Tulane, Bowling Green, ANU in Australia, the University of New South Wales, and Oxford University, where he earned his doctorate in philosophy in politics. He's a highly regarded political theorist, best known for his contribution to multiculturalism and to understanding and the assessment of Hayek's political philosophy. As an author, he is prolific and has co-authored several books, including The Liberal Archipelago, A Theory of Diversity and Freedom. Please welcome Professor Chandran Kukathas.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Well, first of all, thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to this. It's great to be here, and I've always been a kind of fringe thinker, but now I'm actually at the Edinburgh Fringe and contributing to it, so this is really a bit of a treat. I'm going to talk to you about Adam Smith and immigration. And as you'll see very quickly, there's not that Smith did not have a lot to say about immigration, but I'm not a Smith scholar, I'm a Smith admirer, and what I'm going to really tell you about is much more about Smith's thinking than about passages in The Wealth of Nations or The Theory of Moral Sentiments or any of his other works on immigration. But hopefully by the end of the lecture, you'll have a bit of a sense of why I've chosen this particular theme. I'm not sure how many of you know Smith well and how many of you have a deep knowledge of him and how many of you just know the name Adam Smith. So I'm going to assume a very, very modest level of knowledge on the part of everyone. So my apologies to those who know Smith intimately, but there's a balance to be struck. So Adam Smith was a Scottish philosopher. He was born about 300 years ago in June 1723 and lived until July 1790. He achieved long-lasting fame, as some of you already know, as the author of The Wealth of Nations, for which he became known as the founder of modern economics. But increasingly, his earlier book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, has come to be acknowledged as one of the most significant contributions ever made to moral philosophy. And in his writings, he's also touched on numerous other topics, from the history of astronomy to the origin of languages, to rhetoric. His range is quite astonishing. But he made, as I said, no noteworthy contribution to the subject of immigration, even though his fellow Scots, over the course of 3 centuries, up until his death, proved themselves to be among the most migration-inclined of all the European peoples. The Scots migrated for a variety of reasons. The most obvious one was to fight the English. As early as the 15th century, some 15,000 Scottish soldiers joined their nobles to fight the English in France. And by the end of the 18th century, they'd also fought them in other parts of Europe and North America. In fact, it was said that when the Americans first rebelled against the English, the English soldiers were very reluctant to shoot against their fellow Englishmen, because that's how they regarded the American rebels. The English military struggled with this until someone hit upon the brainwave of getting Scottish soldiers to come to America. And they had much less difficulty shooting Americans or Englishmen. Okay? So the martial abilities of the Scots did not go unnoticed, and Scottish mercenaries were soon in high demand in Poland and Scandinavia in particular, as well as in the Netherlands, in Spain, in Russia, and in Bohemia. And soldiers of all ranks ended up settling in the lands in which they did battle. And some of the officers even acquired titles and joined the nobilities of their adopted countries in various parts of Europe. But the Scots also migrated or traveled for other reasons. Like Adam Smith himself, they went abroad to study or to meet and mingle with other scholars. They also went as peddlers, merchants, and craftsmen. By the end of the 19th century, there were substantial Scottish communities in Poland, in Denmark, in France, and other countries in Europe. The success of these emigrant Scots encouraged an outflow of their poorer countrymen, since one important reason for leaving Scotland was to escape destitution and secure employment. And as changing economic circumstances saw the emptying of the rural areas, both in the Highlands and the lowlands of Scotland, and as there was a drift to the cities, so did many Scottish landowners start to encourage their tenants to leave, and even subsidize those who could not afford rent to leave those properties and to emigrate. So there was a certain amount of subsidization of emigration from Scotland. Large numbers also moved to England, although not everyone there was as pleased to see so many Scots, and I quote, idly sauntering and lithering about. The word lithering is one that's sadly lost to English usage, but I think we should revive it. The Scots were idly sauntering and lithering about in England to the dismay of the English. With emigration came immigration, though, to Scotland, mostly by students. By Smith's time, Scotland had at least 5 highly regarded universities, and these attracted scholars from around Europe. The tradition of going abroad to study had been very strong since the Middle Ages, and by 1600, Scots could be found teaching in Coimbra in Portugal, in Cologne, in Paris, in Rouen, in Padua, and particularly in the Netherlands, which had an exceptional concentration of universities. So the consequence of all of this was that by the beginning of the 18th century, Scotland was well and truly integrated into European academic, cultural, religious, and commercial life. Nor did this movement of people cease or slow down over time. In the 20th century alone, Scotland saw a net emigration of an estimated 2 million people, though it had by then also admitted and assimilated a significant number of English, Jewish, Irish, and Lithuanian people, all of whom brought their own distinctive stamps to Scottish society. Still, if Adam Smith had little, if anything, to say about any of this, why consider the matter of Smith and immigration, which looks like it has all the makings of a very brief lecture, and it is fairly brief. Okay. I think there's something that we can learn from Adam Smith on this subject, both by looking more closely at what he said and by considering it in the context of the world in which he lived. And these two things, I think, are not unrelated. For while he was a scholar and a theoretician, he was equally an acute observer of the world around him, and the conclusions he advanced were grounded in a thorough understanding and appreciation of the workings of society. That society is, unsurprisingly, very different from our own in many ways, but in certain respects, it is similar enough that we can recognize Smith's insights into his own world as insights into our own as well. Okay? So, how was 18th century Scotland similar to our own society? So one historian and scholar of Scottish immigration, Christopher Smout, put it in the following way. The Scots of Adam Smith's time were, even more than the English, Europeans. They were not, and I'm quoting Smout here, a remote, insular people sitting on the fringes of civilization, but a cosmopolitan people exceptionally prone to emigrate to seek their fortunes in another country, and with a reputation for competence, whether their trade was learning, killing, or buying and selling. Part of this is the martial tradition, the willingness to be a paid fighter in an army, which stretches in unbroken sequence from the 100 Years' War to the Gulf War. Part of it, Smout continues, is a professional tradition. Scots traded and taught from Cadiz to Danzig, just as now they can be found running oil refineries in Thailand and occupying chairs in Auckland. Scotland, he continues, was a European country, more at ease in and less suspicious of other cultures. That is Professor Smout. We live today in a world that has been profoundly shaped by European ideas, by European political institutions, cultural contributions, ethical values, and language. This is in part through Europe's colonial legacies, but it is also the product of the two-way movement of people from Europe to the rest of the world, and from the rest of the world to Europe, and the lands the Europeans settled in America and Australasia. The impact of Scotland in all of this is more significant than its size and location suggests. Indeed, the American historian Arthur Herman goes so far as to assert that the Scots invented the modern world. those most responsible for shaping that world were the Scottish thinkers of the 18th century. Perhaps the most notable of these was Adam Smith. So it is to him that we can reasonably turn for insight into the nature of that modern world. Yet again, Smith said almost nothing directly about immigration, a topic that dominates our own conversations today, but was scarcely mentioned in his day. This is not because there were no restrictions on the movement of people in those days, or that governments were entirely uninterested in the question. The British government of the 1700s forcibly transported tens of thousands of its own subjects to colonies in North America and Australasia, and shipped almost 400,000 slaves across the North Atlantic. And the government of the newly independent United States was very conscious of the importance of immigration. One of its grievances against the Crown laid down in the Declaration of Independence, having been that it had been, and I quote from the Declaration, obstructing the laws for the naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither. Immigration control was already a part of life. But on the whole, immigration was not viewed as something about which to be concerned, even if some did express anxieties about the arrival of foreigners, though equally the implications of immigration were often considered more serious, since in some regions the loss of labor could be more threatening to the prosperity or even survival of communities. But these considerations aside, immigration was not the issue that it is today. So what then can we learn from Adam Smith? Do his insights have anything to contribute to our understanding of immigration? To answer this question, we need to look more closely at Smith's most important ideas, in economics, of course, but also in morality. We might begin with Smith's most famous work, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, or simply the Wealth of Nations, which was first published in 1776. What, Smith asked, was the source of a country's wealth? To answer this question, he thought required above all recognizing that wealth had to be understood not in terms of the quantity or the amount of gold or specie found in a government's treasuries, but in the well-being of the population, ultimately in the well-being of ordinary people. A nation whose public coffers were full, but whose people lived in poverty, was not wealthy. The path to prosperity, therefore, could not be a policy that emphasized increasing the nation's monetary holdings, but only one that enabled people to put their talents to productive use, to create and to consume what they created. What made wealth grow was the capacity to produce more, to increase the returns to our efforts. And critically important here, Smith says, is the division of labor. As we learned to specialize and to cooperate by allocating different tasks to different people, we found ways not only to produce more, but also to create things that could not be done alone. The simplest example Smith used to illustrate this was the case of the pin factory, in which no single person was responsible for the production of any one pin, despite the fact that collectively the workers could produce hundreds of thousands of pins almost in a day. The point Smith wished to make here was not merely that assembly lines could be more efficient than other forms of manufacture, true though that might be, for the division of labor had begun before the pin factory received an ounce of the metal needed to manufacture its products. Others had already taken on the other tasks that needed to be completed. The mining of ores, the transporting of these and other ingredients needed for production. And yet others had contributed by supplying the transport needed to bring materials to the factory and indeed the factories themselves needed to be built. In primitive societies, the division of labor was rudimentary, but as societies became more complex, the division of labor became more sophisticated as the extent of specialization increased. Now, all of this is obvious enough, but the significance of the division of labor, in Smith's view, was something that could be better understood. In part, he wished to make clear not only that the division of labor enabled us to produce more and to do so more cheaply, he also wanted to emphasize that so much of what we create could not be produced at all without the division of labor. No single person could manufacture a car or a plane or a microchip because no one could even identify all the elements of the processes involved, let alone master all skills needed or set up the structures within which production has to take place. Producing the simplest things involves both directly and indirectly the efforts of millions of people. Is there a limit to the number of people involved in the process of creation? This question brings us to the next idea that Smith was at pains to emphasize. The extent of the division of labor was determined by the extent of the market. The market here means nothing more than the realm within which people are able to exchange what they have for what others wish to offer. The larger the number of people who can contribute to our collective endeavor, the better we are able to produce what we value. The fewer the restrictions on what or how we might contribute, the greater the range and volume of talent or ability that can be brought to bear on our endeavors, and the better able are we to produce what we value. So the extent of the market is crucial, but how might the extent of the market be limited? Most obviously, Smith thought, by restrictions on trade. Preventing people from trading, whether internationally or domestically, reduced the extent of the market, thus not only contributing to rises in prices, but also stifling innovation by giving an unwarranted advantage to established enterprises. There was seldom any justification for restricting the freedom of people to offer what they have, whether their goods or their labor, in exchange for what would bring them benefit or advantage. The great danger to human prosperity and flourishing came not from trade or exchange, but from the emergence and protection of monopolies, systematic advantages conferred on a few by restricting the freedom of others. This brings us quickly then to the subject of immigration, even if indirectly. In Smith's Scotland, as we've noted, it was entirely unremarkable that people should move in search of opportunity to offer their labor or their services to make a living, whether by buying and selling, or teaching, or taking paid employment, or putting the English to the sword. And it was no less unremarkable that people should come to Scotland to ply their trades or to study. Or to prevent people from doing this was, for Smith, more or less preposterous, not least because it was harmful to the poor. He was particularly exercised by restrictions that prevented the least well-off from improving their condition. In a striking passage from The Wealth of Nations, he wrote, "The patrimony of a poor man lies in the strength and dexterity of his hands, and to hinder him from employing this strength and dexterity in what manner he thinks proper without injury to his neighbor is a plain violation of his most sacred property. It is a manifest encroachment upon the just liberty both of the workman and of those who might be disposed to employ him." Here, clearly, Smith does not think it was only the worker who was harmed by such restrictions. employers too were wrongfully deprived of their freedom by laws preventing them from hiring. Of such laws, Smith said, as it hinders the one from working at what he thinks proper, so it hinders the others from employing whom they think proper. To judge whether he is fit to be employed may surely be trusted to the discretion of the employers whose interest it so much concerns. The affected anxiety of the lawgiver lest they should employ an improper person is evidently as impertinent as it is oppressive. Now, Smith did not say, except for employers hiring foreign workers, or except for foreigners looking for work, no such qualification could be justified. And in the cosmopolitan Scotland of his day, no reminder was needed. The language Smith uses in these passages should also alert us to another element in his thinking. For him, the restrictions placed on people looking to work or to employ are bad not merely because they bring about inefficiencies or a loss of wealth, though that was undoubtedly one consideration of which he was acutely aware. Smith calls the hindrances on worker and employer, and I quote again, manifest encroachments on the just liberty of both. His critique was not only an economic one, but also a moral one. It would be well then at this point to turn to Smith's other great book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Published 17 years before The Wealth of Nations, this work more than any other reveals the breadth of Smith's ethical concerns. It was common for a long time to regard Smith as an economist who wanted simply to explain how markets were efficient mechanisms for maximizing wealth by taking advantage of human selfishness. In this famous passage, he said, it is from the self-interest of the butcher, the baker, and the brewer that we are able to get our dinner, for it is their concern for themselves and for themselves alone that supplies them with the incentive to produce and sell at the cheapest price, even though they otherwise have no feeling for us at all. The invisible hand that moved through the marketplace was animated by an indifferent heart, or so people thought, Smith believed. But that is not how Smith understands things, and it's not how he understands us. In the Theory of Moral Sentiments, he tells us we are above all social creatures, and we are moved first and foremost by our sympathy for our fellows, by our capacity to put ourselves in the shoes of others and to imagine their sufferings as well as their joys. It is this capacity that creates us, for we are not born ethical beings, but become ethical through our experience of others, and because we can enter their lives through our imaginations. How does this happen? How do we become ethical beings? Our moral development, Smith explains, is the product of our sociability. For as we enter through the imagination into the lives of others, we find ourselves sympathizing with their joys and sorrows and coming to want their good opinion of us, their approval. We find ourselves adapting our conduct to comport with the attitudes and behavior of others, to try to become subjects of their approbation. Once this happens, however, we notice that not everyone thinks the same way, and we find ourselves wanting not merely to be approved by others, but to be worthy of approval. Ethical standards develop as we engage with others and reflect on the different sensibilities and behaviors that people evince. Morality and moral development do not come from laws or from rulers. It is not the product of the artifice of politicians, as some thinkers like Bernard Mandeville seem to suggest. It is the result of the free interplay of human beings trying to discover what is valuable, what is good, what is right. as human beings, we are, if nothing else, an experimenting species, constantly trying new things, new ideas, new possibilities. And we get these ideas from others by adopting or adapting what we find to see if it works. That process is unending. That goes not only for the marketplace, but for the whole of life. And just as in the economic realm, we have little reason to limit the extent of the market, so in the realm of ethical experimentation, we have no reason to limit our engagement with others. It would be stretching things too far to conclude from this that Adam Smith would have advanced any particular policy or express any particular opinion about the questions of immigration. We cannot say from reading him that he would have allowed this or not allowed that. And it's not my purpose to suggest any such thing. But I do think we can learn something from Smith when we think about this and other issues if we understand the sort of sensibility he evinces and the kind of reasoning he used. Adam Smith was in the end a kind of advocate of what Karl Popper famously called the open society. And an open society is one that is in many ways intellectually, culturally, economically, politically, and philosophically open. It is not closed because it is open to change, to moral development. This outlook, I think, is what lies at the heart of the thought of Adam Smith. Thank you.
Great. So we're going to have a Q&A, and a microphone will be going around. So if you do have a question, please wait till the microphone comes to you. But I'll kick it off by asking a difficult question. If we think about immigration policy, right, and you think about the extent of the market and the failures of the market, isn't much of immigration policy, at least if from the perspective, let's say, the labor movement, it's about protecting workers from the vagaries of the market and from unnecessary competition, because those that come in and compete with workers, they can undercut not simply wages, but the other kind of social fabric that allows for workers to be productive. So I'm curious in terms of, if we think about Smith and in his recognition of the limits of markets, but then at the same time, Smith's kind of apprehension for overregulation of anything for that matter, how then can we take Adam Smith's sensibilities on the sociality, right, that makes the human condition, with the understanding of markets and their limitations, and I don't know if that's
I think I understand what you're driving at, because well, the first thing I guess one should say is that Smith was not against regulation. He was concerned about externalities, about the effects of markets on people. He recognized that there were many things markets didn't supply. And so while he was very much a defender of what we would now call markets, or this is not the language he would have used, he wasn't uncritical of market institutions, and he thought that important reforms were needed. He didn't discuss this with respect to immigration, but we can see a little bit of how he might have reasoned about it if we think about, say, the situation we find ourselves in today, and the point you've just made about the impact of, let's say, an infusion of workers on existing domestic workers. But the problem here is that it's not evident that this is the instrument that we need to use to control or limit immigration. One obvious reason for this is that one of the advantages that Smith was very keen on was the advantages that come with the extension of the market. The wider the market is, the greater the gains that we will have. And with immigration, with people coming in, able to contribute to the market economy, you could, of course, have some people who are disadvantaged by the fact that they're outcompeted in the labor market. But at the same time, since those coming in as immigrants could be both complements to existing labor as well as substitutes for existing labor, those whose labor is substituted might be disadvantaged, but those whose labor is complemented by the immigrant workers will see their skills expanding, those enterprises prospering, and more people employed in those industries. Now, it's a difficult question to answer. What will be the net effect? Will an increase in immigration lead to more employment overall, or will it lead to less employment overall? It could be that a mixture of these two things will happen. Some people will lose jobs, but others will gain jobs. If you cut immigration, on the other hand, some people will retain their jobs, but others may lose them. So it would not do simply to think about, okay, here's this one simple tool that we have to address this question, because the market is, as Smith tried to show, a complex place. Again, it's not that there's no need for any kind of regulation, but the thing that Smith, I think, was most concerned about was that many of the regulations that were put in place looked like they were designed for the advantage of everybody, but in fact what they did was they conferred advantage on a particular class of people who then benefited and told everybody else it was for the good of society as a whole, when it wasn't.
I'm going to ask one more question, if I may, before I turn it over to the audience. Probably a more difficult one is that, okay, so we know that, particularly in the Scottish Enlightenment, the idea of society, and as you mentioned in your lecture, how we aren't socialized by edict, but by experience, and that's how we form our communities. In the case of migration, and if you think of the politics of migration, particularly in Europe or the UK for that matter, the issue often comes down to less of the economic focus, but that of the multicultural focus. And I'm just curious how Smith would approach the issue of multiculturalism as being how that integrates with the sociality aspect in relation to as a secondary concern for this market regulation aspect, in that like you said, the economic arguments for migration are actually pretty solid, but now you hear people saying, well, it's not the economics that matter for us. It's the culture, it's the history, it's the shared identity, particularly in Europe. I mean, for me, what you said about Scottish history, I have Scottish heritage where they emigrated to Canada and then to the United States, and now I'm back here in Scotland, and the American experience is one of very much of migration, and it's still part of that. And so any kind of identitarian arguments really fall flat. But here in Europe, at least, and I'm including the UK, you increasingly hear it's the identity aspect. And how would Smith approach that, or how could we take from his work a way of appreciating that element of the pushback against migration?
Yeah. Well, thinking about it in Smithian terms, seeing Smith as an advocate of what I've just called the open society, I think there are some points that he would, if not make himself directly, certainly appreciate, and that is that the way in which society evolves, morally speaking and culturally, does involve the interaction with other people, and to some extent this is unavoidable. In his own day, it simply happened because people did move, that they did trade, they did go abroad to study, others came in. But even without the internet, books and ideas came in to Scotland, as it also happened in other countries. So transformation is always taking place. If you think about the modern world, how much of the cultural transformation that we experience is due simply to the fact that we are so interconnected in multiple ways, so that, you know, nowadays people in schools in London or in Paris may be more familiar with K-pop and K-dramas than they are with Dickens or with Molière. Okay? I'm not saying that's a good thing, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it is a feature of that world. Of course, the movement of peoples is also going to be a contributor to this, but I doubt very much that one could prevent all of this change from happening by trying to control immigration. For one thing, nobody is thinking, perhaps North Korea might be an exception, nobody is thinking of ending immigration or ending tourism or ending cultural exchanges through universities or stopping Real Madrid coming and playing Manchester United. These things are going to keep happening. So the tool of immigration control to arrest cultural transformation is a very, very limited tool. I mean, unless you're going to prevent not only people from migrating for reasons of taking up jobs, but you're also going to stop tourists from talking to the English or the Scots or the French. These things are going to happen anyway. I mean, I think it's simply not something that you can control. What you can think about is how you might take advantage of it, how you might protect certain elements of your own culture if you want that, although difficult in a diverse society because you've got to all then agree on what it is, yes. Now, if you think that the culture is capacious, then immigration is not a problem. If you think that the culture is narrow, well, you better check with your fellow countrymen because they may not all agree with your definition of that narrow culture. So, yeah, I think the immigration control solution is a very, very limited kind of tool for this kind of engagement.
Okay. So I see hands going up. We'll start with the gentleman there. Just please wait for the microphone to come and then...
Thank you very much. Fascinating talk. Now, my question is in fact continuation of your question. I mean, if I remember correctly, Max Weber, for instance, about 100 years later, was very concerned about Polish workers coming to German Reich and so on. So something must have happened that time. So I was wondering whether you could say something about Adam Smith against the background of his time. Did this concern with immigration came in the context of nation states and ethnic romantic nation idea of 19th century? What would the French physiocrats say? Would they be open to? So how does this compare to what was thought in Europe around the same time and was thought maybe in Europe in this country over the 100 years after Max Weber?
Yes. Well, Smith was,
Thank you very much. Fascinating talk. Now, my question is in fact continuation of your question. I mean, if I remember correctly, Max Weber, for instance, about 100 years later, was very concerned about Polish workers coming to German Reich and so on. So something must have happened that time. So I was wondering whether you could say something about Adam Smith against the background of his time. Did this concern with immigration came in the context of nation states and ethnic romantic nation idea of 19th century? What would the French physiocrats say? Would they be open to? So how does this compare to what was thought in Europe around the same time and was thought maybe in Europe in this country over the 100 years until Max Weber?
Lithuanians who came and settled in Scotland at a certain time. I think as Catholics they were originally going to go to England and then England said, no, sorry, and so they ended up in Scotland. They formed an important community, but there was a lot of tension with the domestic community. I think that story could be told right across Europe, whether you're talking about Holland or France or Spain or Germany. This is just a natural part of the way the world is. Newcomers have to find ways of assimilating, but they also want to find ways of preserving their own traditions. In time, I think, if history tells us anything, these things will get sorted out. The domestic population will change in some ways. The newcomers will also adapt. New things will emerge. Languages will change. Vocabularies will be introduced. And I think, this is, in a way, nothing so surprising. Perhaps this isn't surprising either, but sometimes I'm surprised by the fact that despite that experience of history, so many people think that there is some solution to this process that can be handed down from on high rather than letting people figure it out for themselves. And I think for Smith, that's really the way to go. Most of these things should be solved by people engaging with one another at that ground level rather than by trying to find some perspective of what he would call the man of system, who thinks he can move the chessboards across the or move people about the society as if they were pieces on a chessboard. Smith says you just can't do that.
Hi. I think from the viewpoint of the wealth of nations, though, I mean, the contentious point was whether fragmented markets was really going to be the way to wealth creation. So one problem is that it's great that the market becomes globalized, but his pin industry, for example, was only 4 players in the world left by 1980. Most sectors have gone to global oligopoly where a few players dominate. And today those sectors have incredible amount of wealth. I mean, think of the top internet companies, etc. So one blind spot that David Hume took him up on was, you are underestimating the wealth
is that
creation
you're absolutely
from
right
the East India
about
Company.
I
mean, at one fell swoop, we acquired even 2 regions of India, gave Britain, they were much bigger than Britain on GDP. So he's rather understating
with the accumulation of wealth will
the
also
impact of our fantastic, sometimes quasi-monopolistic trading companies that could be very positive.
Can be used within
perhaps, so
markets
I don't know what you think about that area at
transform
the moment.
rules.
That's quite a powerful dynamic, and maybe fragmented markets are not necessarily the way to wealth creation.
The East India Company is a good example of this, but there are other examples as well, which I'm sure you can come up with. I think the main thing that Smith would be skeptical about, though, is the extent of our capacity to control all of this. It's true that wealth will become concentrated, certain sectors of the economy will become powerful, parts of the market will fragment and break off. It's not as if this is something that then we can say, okay, how do we solve this problem? Let's figure out a global policy or a national policy to address this. It's not going to happen for the very reasons that the examples suggest, that these entities will become powerful. What we can, though, I think, expect is that over time, all of these powers will also disappear. I mean, Microsoft and Apple and Amazon looked untouchable, but IBM did as well, and US Steel did as well. And these are no longer in the top 10. And in 50 years, I would bet that none of these companies will be where they are now. Of course, I can say that because I won't be around in 50 years. So, but if I had to make a bet, that's what I would guess. I would also think that the chances of developing a policy that controls all of this is very, very slim, because there's simply no example anywhere in history of our actually achieving that.
And that's what we see with the kind of U.S.-China battle is, one, it's the claim is it's about protecting national security, and there's probably a lot of truth to that, but also it's about trying to diminish the competition that major Chinese tech companies and other state-owned enterprises or private sector Chinese companies that they challenge to these major companies. And it's interesting to see the dynamic that's happening in the US, but also in Europe in terms of throwing massive amounts of money to not really control inflation as it's supposed to do, but to try to change the system in a way that really pushes back on the competitive edge of China in particular areas. And Smith, I think, would be quite skeptical of, well, you can try, but it's that man of system moment, if you like, and it's unlikely to really shift the
Yeah. But of course, the Chinese are doing exactly that themselves.
Exactly.
Okay, with even less success.
Yeah.
Because I think they're starting from a much lower economic base, even though it looks on the surface that they've got this capacity to do it, and certainly, politically, they've got less resistance.
Right.
But it's just obviously failing.
And Singapore's sitting there trying to figure out where it sits in between.
Yes,
but that's
yes.
another conversation. There was two hands there. So the woman in the front there, and then.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you for your fantastic lecture. It was really clear, helpful. I wonder what you think, if Adam Smith was an economic advisor to Scotland today, what do you think he would be advising the Scottish Government in terms of our population or potential population crisis, where our population is decreasing all the time, so we really need to encourage international investment and international immigration to Scotland? What do you think? I was just thinking about in the early noughties when we had a lot of Eastern European, particularly Polish immigrants who came to Scotland, and they really filled. Thank you, Professor, and thank you for your fantastic lecture. It was really clear, helpful. I wonder what you think, if Adam Smith was an economic advisor to Scotland today, what do you think he would be advising the Scottish Government in terms of our population or potential population crisis, where our population is decreasing all the time, so we really need to encourage international investment and international immigration to Scotland?
I don't know enough
what do you
about
think?
Scotland.
I was just thinking about in the early noughties when we had a lot of Eastern European, particularly Polish immigrants who came to Scotland, and they really filled a crisis gap for us in terms of the tourist industry in the Highlands, where nobody wanted to work in that industry, and we had incredibly intelligent people with degrees coming from Eastern Europe able to fill those jobs, just wanted to be here and have now worked their way up.
I think Scotland probably does have that.
So I wonder what you think
so the
Adam Smith would think about how we maintain and grow our country internationally.
Obstacles or limitations that are making it more difficult for people to exchange freely. He would ask, what is the nature of the tax burden, and to what extent is that burden preventing businesses from operating more successfully, preventing them from attracting the labor that it needs, because if people are taxed heavily, they're going to go elsewhere. And to what extent is the system of administration reasonably efficient? He did famously say in a letter that there was a lot of ruin in a nation. So prosperous nations can stumble along for a very, very long time and still enjoy a reasonable standard of living. And Scotland is, on the whole, I think, a pretty prosperous place. But I think, on the whole, he would say, look at your administration, look at the tax burden, and look at what are the obstacles to people trading, exchanging, setting up businesses, and so on. And if you find there are those obstacles there, That's what you should address.
We have time for one last question. That was the gentleman there.
Thank you for the lecture. You paint a picture of Smith as an advocate for an open society. One of the arguments is that immigrants contribute to a wealth overall. When I think of immigration, and when I follow discussions about it, I sometimes hear the idea that we should limit immigration to a country to people who actually contribute. That seems on a wrong foot with the idea of open society. I'm not an expert, but maybe Australia has some policies that will. Thank you for the lecture. You paint a picture of Smith as an advocate for an open society. One of the arguments is that immigrants contribute to a wealth overall. When I think of immigration,
I agree
and when I
that
follow
actually the
discussions
people
about
you
it,
want in the
you
country
sometimes
are those who are
hear
most able
the
to
idea
contribute.
that we should
The problem
limit
is
immigration
we
to a
don't
country
know who those people
to
are.
people who
Okay?
actually
I mean, there
contribute.
are all kinds of people who want to come in.
That seems
Sometimes those who look like they're going to
on a
contribute
wrong
the
foot
most
with the idea
have
of an
the
open
least capacity
society.
to do it.
I'm
And
not an
sometimes we
expert, but
find
maybe
that
Australia
the least
has some
likely
policies
people
that will
are the most successful. It's an interesting
that try to
feature of the
guarantee that
modern
people
world
that come there are
the most successful
they have a chance of
enterprises
success
are founded
to
by
contribute
immigrants.
to the
And
economic
among
wealth
those,
of the country.
the most
How would you regard
dynamic
that
and
from a
innovative
liberal
and financially
viewpoint
successful,
as Smith has?
those immigrants are refugees, who are typically people who arrive with almost nothing. So there's something about that process of selection that generates wealth, but we don't know how to isolate those particular people and who to exclude. I'm reminded of a preface that the humorist P.J. O'Rourke wrote to one of his books, where he talked about sitting on the beach, sipping a margarita, chatting to his friend Ed, and a brown-bodied man comes in out of the surf. He's clothed, and they speculate about whether this is a Cuban immigrant, an asylum seeker. And O'Rourke says, this guy, if he is such a person, he's probably escaped an oppressive regime at great cost to himself. He's found his way across the ocean through shark-infested waters. He's arrived here with absolutely nothing, but is willing to take a chance. That's the kind of people we want in America, okay? But there's no policy that's going to tell you that, because it's very hard to point to anyone and say, yes, and that person is going to be the entrepreneur who creates Google, or the guy who's going to found this medical center. I'll give you one last anecdote. I went to a winery in Crete a few months ago, and had lovely wine. But it turned out that the winery was built by a guy who had left Crete as a young child, under 10. Because it was after the war and they were poor, his mother sent the 3 children, son and 2 daughters, to the United States to be cared for by relatives there. The day before they landed on Ellis Island, the person who was due to meet them died. So there was no one to greet them at the docks, and they lived on the streets for a few days until some Greeks recognized their Cretan accents, took them in, and raised them, sent the boy to university. He founded the security company that discovered the Watergate break-in. He became immensely wealthy, returned to Crete, reopened the family home, built a winery, and but no one would have guessed that a child heading off to the United States, who ends up living on the streets, would have had that kind of success. Partly it's luck, obviously, but there's a bit of luck involved for everybody.
No, but I think there's that, what you said, I mean, there's in the immigration debates, it says we only want the most educated. They want people like me, highly educated people to come. But then it misses the point of what you said, these different stories. And I can think of my own, coming from the United States, was an immigrant country, is that the people came, they were dirt poor and they didn't have anything. And I look at my own, and sorry for bringing my own kind of personal story into this, but I feel like I'm in the home of Adam Smith, yet that a few generations back, people were, pretty destitute, but they came of an Italian great-grandfather that came when he was 18, worked in coal mines and then a steel mill, built houses on the side, and, a few generations later, back in Europe, or family of mine from the Highlands that late 19th century came and were, entrepreneurs, and you won't know that, if we let these people in, what they're going to do. And that's the problem, I think, with some of these debates now, is that we only want to select the very best, but actually you don't know who those people are, because they might be something, or their children or their grandchildren are going to be the ones that are make you prosperous and innovate. And I think that's, it's like the Polish going and working in the Highland tourist sector. They were needed, and now they're part of the fabric. And had said no to them, then something would have been lost.
Yeah.
So on that note, sorry for taking the last note, but I think that was a great lecture. Let's please give a round of applause for Professor Chandran Kukathas. Thank you so much.
Thank you.